More than $354 million. New York Attorney General Letitia James had accused the former president and his organization of overstating his net worth in order to win favorable terms on loans. In September, New York Supreme Court Judge Arthur Engoron found Trump had committed fraud for more than a decade, but had not yet ruled on 6 other claims that we just learned about today. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins me now. Bob, does today's ruling mean, what does it mean, rather, for the former president? We know this is not a criminal case. This really affects his business dealings.
Jerika, good to be with you. This is not a criminal case. It is a civil fraud case, but this penalty is sweeping in scope. Former President Donald Trump and his co-defendants in this case ordered today by Judge Arthur Engoron to pay out more than $300 million, about $350 million in damages, because he believes that the Trump organization, led by former President Trump for many years, defrauded the state of New York. And not only is there a financial penalty as part of this ruling, a very comprehensive ruling by Engoron, we're also seeing former President Donald Trump being barred from being a director or leader of any corporation in the state of New York for the next 3 years. That's a directive for not only Trump, but other co-defendants in this case, including the former chief financial executive at the Trump organization, Alan Weisselberg. And Donald Trump's own sons, Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., are barred from being in an executive or leadership main position at a New York company for the next 2 years. Now, for some people, this kind of ruling maybe wouldn't be that dramatic. But for the Trump family, which is so intertwined with the Trump organization, going back to Fred Trump, the former president's father, who built all of these developments in the New York City boroughs in the 1960s and 1970s, and then Trump as he developed his own properties in the 80s and 90s, the family is the business. And Trump has so much of his valuation as part of his brand, as part of his marketing value. And now he is going to likely have to find significant amount of cash to pay out this penalty. And as he pays out this penalty, he will, of course, try to appeal it in the coming months, but he will also be under a cash crunch. He's facing the E. Jean Carroll civil penalty of over $80 million. He was found liable of rape in that civil case in New York. And for someone who doesn't have his whole business in cash, this is a real challenge facing him. We don't have direct details on how he's going to pay it out yet and the timeline for how he will be ordered to do so. But what's important to know here is over $300 million now could be coming out of the Trump coffers to the state of New York. And while he pays that out, he can't work as an executive in the state.
All right. That's absolutely right. I'm joined now here with Scott McFarland and Major Garrett. I want to talk to you about Donald Trump's children, because there are moments where the judge mentions them in this as well. You guys are just going through the documents right now. I just got them handed to me here. But as we're learning about more of the details, what more can you say about the children involved in all of this?
The judge is pretty emphatic about this and unequivocal, saying Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, according to sufficient evidence, intentionally falsified business records, and the penalties extend to them too. They are also banned now from running a corporation in the state of New York for 2 years. You'll also recall during the trial, they took the stand. So did Ivanka Trump, and those are some of the most powerful moments of the trial. Ivanka Trump there for hours answering questions about what her brothers, her father, and she did with this corporation. It truly was part of the spectacle that was this trial, but in the meat of this judgment is a ban on the sons from running a business and a clear statement from the judge they were intentional in their falsifications.
And Major, I want to turn to you, because you've been covering all parts of everything related to Donald Trump, and not just this case, but the other ones as well. What type of impact does this have on his campaign, especially knowing just recently we learned about the March 25th start of the trial? Well, he will have to be present for several weeks.
Sure. So we have lots of different legal buckets where the former president is involved. You have criminal, you have civil. This is civil, but this is much larger than that. It's reputational. This strikes at the very heart of Donald Trump's larger American story of being an aggressive deal maker who makes things happen and who builds fortunes for himself and for others. And what this case has always been about is, was there something illegitimate about all those representations within the Trump real estate empire? Were things valued more than they were worth? Were things misrepresented to momentarily provide financial advantage to the Trump family or the Trump organization at some harm either to the state of New York or to creditors or borrowers? And this case is really about, yes, in fact, when you look at the numbers and when you scrutinize everything that was marketed about the Trump brand and the Trump name, it didn't add up. And no case on the docket in the last 2 years has more infuriated the former president than this one.
It was personal, without a doubt. I want to turn now to political campaign reporter Katrina Kaufman. She's been following many of the former president's legal troubles. Are you surprised at all by this? Obviously, Letitia James, the Attorney General in New York, asking for $370 million, but $354 million. And it's probably assumed that Trump will appeal this.
Of course he'll appeal. They've been making that clear since day one of this case, that they knew that they were going to lose and that they thought that they would win this case on appeal. I can't say that I'm surprised by this ruling. It is almost what Letitia James asked for. And I was struck by a part of it where the judge talks about the lack of contrition. He says it borders on almost pathological, and that the only thing that Trump would even admit was a mistake was the size of his triplex, which Trump actually did during the closing arguments when he, in court, started speaking for about 5 minutes, really unauthorized by the judge, and I think accidentally admitted that that was a mistake.
And as far as some of what we're talking about in reference to his other legal woes, how do you think this will impact some of the other, the upcoming trial that I just mentioned starting next month, only because it seems that it hasn't necessarily affected him on the campaign trail. Does this sort of start to change the tide, if you will?
I think it impacts him financially. As Bob was saying, he has huge debts to pay now. He has the E. Jean Carroll trial, that's $83.3 million, plus a previous $5 million. Now this is another $350 million. So it's really hurting him financially. And he hasn't done well in New York. He just lost the E. Jean Carroll trial here. He has not done well in the civil fraud verdict. And now he has the hush money trial coming up. And that is going to be the first criminal trial ever prosecuted against a former president.
CBS News, Rachel, thank you. CBS News legal expert and analyst Ricky Kleeman joins us now. Ricky, how does this compare to the criminal cases facing Trump right now?
Well, people might think that the criminal cases are far more significant against Donald Trump because it involves, of course, the possibility of conviction and ultimately the possibility of prison time. However, I would say that I am one of the legal experts, among many others, who firmly believes that this case, above all cases, is the one that disturbs Donald Trump most of all. You have to remember that Donald Trump has felt that Judge Engoron has been prejudiced against him from the very beginning and has been very vocal about that fact, saying that the fraud was the first ruling. And so why were we even having a trial? Because the only thing left was to decide a penalty. So Donald Trump and his lawyers must have fully expected that the penalty would be mighty. The problem here, Jerika, is this. It's not so much only the brand. It's not the mix of the political and the legal for me. What it says to me is if I am Donald Trump's lawyer, I think I have many grounds for appeal, but I've got to post money or a surety bond in order to go forward with the appeal. And in New York, that is a phenomenal amount of money because it's either the $350 million plus interest that you would have to come up with to go forward with the appeal, or it's a surety bond. And who's going to give him a surety bond when the collateral for the bond might be properties that have to be sold? So he's in a very, very difficult position in terms of not only his finances, but in how he projects himself to the world. I think this is far more significant to him and to his attorneys than going forward at the end of March in New York with a criminal case.
All right. And Ricky, we want you to stand by. I want to turn now to Scott McFarland. I know that you've talked about the threats, and it's discussed here in this document, that wasn't just facing the judge, but also those who work around him. How impactful, or what was the message there in this ruling?
In the courtroom for this trial, what struck me most was the ugliness of this trial. There was a gag order issued because Donald Trump was posting on social media conspiracy theories about the judge's clerk, and he persisted in doing so. Those led to some number of threats against the court staff or against the judge's office. And it begs the question, Jerika and Major, are we going to see more of that when Donald Trump returns to court in all these criminal cases that are now stacked up from New York to D.C. to Florida to Georgia? The tenor and tone of this trial were troubling to so many people, and it's not his last time in court.
And it's worth pointing out that in that context that Scott just raised, the former president spends an extravagant amount of time talking about a two-tiered system of justice in this country, alleging that he is a victim of one that is harsher on him than it is on other Americans. Any other defendant who acted as former President Trump did in those social media posts would have received far more harsh a penalty than a momentary, temporary, and limited gag order. They would have probably been held in contempt of court. That was never even on the table for the former president. So in this conduct, in this space that he finds himself where there's permissible room for him to threaten or create the atmosphere of threat around judicial proceedings, he is being encouraged or at least entitled to something that most other Americans would be denied and denied almost instantaneously.
So you don't think this will have an impact in terms of his decorum or how he reacts or responds?
It might or it might not.
Like
what we know that the record established so far is he has been given latitude no other defendant in this country would be.
I want to turn to Robert Costa, who's standing by as well there in New York. You were also in the courtroom for some of this. Has Trump been using this civil trial as a campaign opportunity?
It's been quite a scene, Jerika, to cover in New York over the past few months. Former President Donald Trump has not always been called to be in the courtroom. He has decided voluntarily to appear there, and he doesn't just slip in the back door. He goes in, he talks to this cascade of reporters in front of him, cameras, and he holds court almost like he's on the campaign trail. And he makes a mini speech oftentimes before he enters the courtroom. And sometimes he takes breaks during the course of this civil fraud trial to come outside the room and sharply criticize Judge Engoron and some members of Judge Engoron's staff, to the point where there have been multiple confrontations between the judge and Trump in the courtroom about his conduct, warning Trump that he's going over the line. So there was never a question here about whether fraud took place in the eyes of Judge Engoron. This civil fraud case began with the judge stating he believed there was fraud that took place. It was always going to be about the penalty. But instead of trying to appeal to the judge, be friendly to the judge, Trump has launched not only a legal war against him, but a political war against him. And he has cast the judge as an enemy of Trump, not just someone he's fighting inside the courtroom.
Okay. Robert, thank you. I want to turn back to Ricky. Now that we know, and as we pointed out earlier, it was likely to happen that he would appeal if this wasn't favorable, which how could it be, knowing what we knew going into this? What is next? What will be the process? How long does this sort of drag out? What can you tell us?
Well, the appeal has teeth. One of the things that we do know is that the Associated Press did a study of over 70 cases where there was the situation of this of a magnitude of fraud, and in no case was there a fraud with this magnitude of punishment, an extraordinary sum of dollars of punishment, where there was no victim and ultimately no damage to the victim, being the banks, according to the banks. It's not a situation where people have lost money, let alone lost lives because of a fraud. So when he goes forward through his lawyers with the appeal, assuming that he can come up with money to post for the appeal, he really does have a viable argument that this is a different justice system applying to him and to his business. And because we do not have someone who's saying, I was hurt. This was an argument raised over and over in court, and it was an argument that the judge had said that he did not accept because it didn't matter under this New York 70-year-old statute that you had to have damage to a victim. So there will be a very good appeal, at least in terms of argument on this issue alone. What happens is the appeal has to be docketed. In order, a notice of appeal is filed, it is docketed, but money has to be posted in order for it to go forward. This appeal, some people say it could take a year. Some people say it could take longer. There are other people who will say, no, that the first department of the appellate division, which will be the first appellate court to look at this, has a very complete record and can act expeditiously. I am not quite so optimistic about the question of time. I think these things do take time, and these issues are complicated.
And I wonder how much time, you really have during an election year, and the impact I think that will have on people. And I'm sure, we wait to find out. No one can speculate. But obviously, we've seen sort of this before. We know we've been talking about the various cases that he's involved with, and it seems to sort of, his supporters and whatnot are not taken aback by accusations, allegations, and we don't know what will be the outcome, obviously, with this latest development. I want to turn to Katrina and go back to you in terms of if you believe that Trump is sort of being made an example of. I mean, you heard Ricky just talk about the Associated Press report and having a strong argument for not being treated before like other folks, but obviously not having this kind of money that we're talking about with over $300 million.
Yeah, well, another part of this opinion that stood out to me is Judge Engoron says that New York means business in combating business fraud. And he talks about the harm that false statements inflict on the marketplace. So, maybe he is trying to make an example of Trump here. He wants to show people that they can't conduct this type of fraudulent business practice. And to that end, he also extends, there was a special monitor appointed to oversee the financial dealings of the Trump Organization. And she's going to be kept on for another few years. Before Judge Engoron even released this ruling, she had put out a report, and it showed that she found continued errors in their financial records. So even after this case, or as it was already being tried, this type of fraud was potentially being perpetuated at the organization.
Okay, and I want to turn to Scott McFarland. We talk about sort of the money flowing and surrounding, whether it's Rudy Giuliani or Dominion, some of these other civil cases. What does that mean, and what can we gain from what we know at this point in reference to this case and others that are connected to former President Donald Trump?
It's quite something, isn't it? People are wondering, when's Donald Trump going to stand trial in these criminal cases? And he is successfully throwing sand in the gears and pushing these trial dates back. There was supposed to be a trial on March 4th in the election subversion case. That's going to be punted till summer at the earliest. But the money cases are moving, not just the defamation case involving E. Jean Carroll. This massive judgment today. And then there are the related cases involving 2020. Rudy Giuliani loses in order to pay tens of millions of dollars. That massive Fox News Dominion defamation settlement for nearly $750 million. There's no criminal accountability yet for the former president, but you can see the civil cases are moving along pretty swiftly.
And Tarika, to Ricky's point about this case, and is it fundamentally different than other New York cases? Well, as the judge in this very lengthy opinion tries to go to some lengths to explain, it is different in magnitude and duration, and as Katrina mentioned, this idea of pathology, this repetitive process of deceiving people in your business practices. The judge may argue, and the appellate court will have to decide, is it rare enough and exceptional enough to warrant this kind of procedural remedy? That's what the appeals court is going to decide. The Trump lawyers will say, no, this is only happening because it's a political effort to weaken the former president, and everyone involved with moving this case forward will say, no, your business practices are yours, you're the author of them, and you must be held accountable.
Because, again, we've been at this table, and maybe not myself normally covering something like this special report, but you guys, without a doubt, what do you expect to hear from the former president? Do you think he comes out with a statement or speaks to the public today?
Well, there's no question about that. And let's not ignore, Tarika, the racial component of this. The former president has said Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, is a racist and is doing this for race-based reasons. He has played that aggressively. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, but that is part of his angry, volatile political response to this. Quite separate from what your documents say, what do the numbers add up to, what are the appraisals, what are the valuations? No. He wants to put this in as toxically charged a political context as possible. That has been part of his past. It may be part of his most immediate future.
He stepped out of that courtroom each time he could before the media called the Attorney General a racist, called the case a witch hunt, and said that he should be paid damages for what he's suffering and what his family's going through. It has seemed to galvanize some level of political support for him, so I expect him to continue with that drumbeat.
Because it's not over and we know there will be an appeal process, is this a win for Letitia James?
It is a successful response to a case she brought. I'm not in the business of describing wins and losses for prosecutors or attorney generals. She had to know, anyone who brings a case against the former president knows, and this is certainly playing out in Fulton County, if you take on the former president, you are taking on a phalanx of attorneys and supporters and scrutinizers. Everything will be scrutinized to the nth degree. Letitia James knew that. There's a remedy today that's now favorable to what she brought before the judge.
And Ricky, same question to you. I mean, again, you've been there, you've been in courtrooms, you're very familiar, obviously, with Letitia James, how this case was played out. You know, she wanted a permanent barring for Donald Trump. It was 3 years based on this ruling. Is this not only just, obviously, Major pointed out, successful, but in your opinion, in your eyes, is this good for her?
This is a huge win for Letitia James. You have to remember she is the one who, in fact, absolutely got this started, that she is the person who, as I said on the day that this was filed, she dared, absolutely dared, the district attorney in New York, Alvin Bragg, to go forward with a prosecution, which he had declined to do. And so she wins. Anybody who says, well, she didn't get it all, she got so much of it all, she is definitely going to be someone who can celebrate tonight. At the same time, you have to remember that there are lawyers involved in all of these cases and that there are different lawyers involved in each case. This appeal is going to go forward with vigor. At the same time, there's a different group of lawyers that is going to go try the Alvin Bragg, New York City, New York County criminal case involving falsification of business records. At the same time, there is a different group of lawyers that is going to go looking forward at the January 6th case and on through the others. Donald Trump is not stopped by this verdict. If anything, he's going to be energized by this judgment, not a verdict, by this judgment from this judge, which Donald Trump and his lawyers fully anticipated would be bad, and it is. And he has an argument as to why he is the exception to the rule, and that's just what he would like to have.
All right, Ricky, thank you for that. As you heard, we're going to go to Robert Costa. You heard Ricky say this didn't stop him, but energized him. We've now given you a little bit of time to look through that document, and you've been able to pull out some key points here. If you could share with us what you've learned.
Jerika, we're learning new details about what exactly is in this ruling. The defendant, the main one here, former President Donald Trump, being ordered by the judge to pay the plaintiff, the state of New York, $354 million. So you think in just recent months, he now has over $400 million. If you add the E. Jean Carroll $80 million plus to this, you're looking at over $400 million he's now facing against his core finances. But he has to pay $354 million. Eric Trump, his son, liable in the amount of $4 million, approximately $4 million for Eric Trump. Not chump change. Donald Trump Jr., his other son, along with Barron, who's not included in this at all, his youngest son, but his oldest son, Donald Trump Jr., liable for $4 million, approximately. And then Alan Weisselberg, who's been at the center of all the Trump finances and those different court cases that have been circulating Trump organization for a long time, he's liable to the state of New York for $1 million exactly. So you're looking at about $364 million total in penalties for the defendants across the board, $354 million of that $364 million approximately for former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, definitely a large amount of money. Scott McFarland, you're just getting a statement from the Trump organization?
Yeah, and it echoes a lot of what Donald Trump had been saying outside the courthouse each day. He calls this a miscarriage of justice. And he makes this argument that he made regularly during the trial that if this stands, businesses will leave New York. Great businesses will exit the state. The statement includes this excerpt, Tarika. Every member of the New York business community, no matter the industry, should be gravely concerned with this gross overreach and brazen attempt by the Attorney General to exert limitless power where no private or public harm has been established. If allowed to stand, this ruling will only further expedite the continuing exodus of companies from New York. That is the rhythm he was trying to make a drumbeat outside court when he held forth during the trial.
Tarika, there's also something worth noting on page 36 of this ruling, and it talks about a disagreement over the value of Mar-a-Lago, a property that the former president justifiably takes enormous pride in. Let me quote from this directly. Nonetheless, Donald Trump insisted that he believed Mar-a-Lago is worth between $1 billion and $1.5 billion, which would require not only valuing it as a private residence, which the deed prohibits, I'm still quoting here, but as more than the most expensive private residence listed in the country by approximately 400%. The essence of this case is the former president says things are valued as we say they are. And that's the only valuation that matters, what we say they are, not what they actually are, not what they're appraised at, not what their value is to bankers or insurers or others, and particularly tax collectors, where oftentimes the variance benefits the Trump organization on both sides of the ledger, favorable loan rates, lower taxes. This is an example of that.
Just one of many examples. Robert Costa, I understand you just got a statement from one of Donald Trump's attorneys?
That's correct, Tarika. Alina Habba, who we have seen in the courtroom alongside former President Donald Trump throughout the civil fraud trial, has just issued a statement to CBS News and other organizations following this case. She said this verdict is, quote, manifest injustice. And she said, quote, given the grave stakes, we trust that the appellate division will overturn this egregious verdict and end this relentless persecution against my clients. And she says that if this stands as a ruling, quote, New York is no longer open for business. And this statement is indicative of what we're going to see in the coming months. We can't take the context out of this ruling away from what happened today. This happens in the middle of a presidential campaign. Just as former President Trump is about to secure the Republican nomination, should he do well in the South Carolina primary next week and on Super Tuesday in early March, and should he move toward that nomination, he is now going to be facing a criminal trial in New York on those hush money payments starting in late March, just as the general election begins, and having to be facing all of these appeals over this civil fraud ruling and having to potentially pay out hundreds of millions of dollars just months before the Republican National Convention and the election in November. And that's not to even go into what Scott McFarland and others have been covering so well, Trump's looming federal trial on January 6th, which is currently before the Supreme Court, at least in terms of how Trump's immunity or claimed immunity could delay that trial. He's also facing a federal trial on his use of classified material and his bringing of them back from the White House to Mar-a-Lago in Florida. All of this now circles Trump. But for Trump, having covered him for many years, it was, as Major and others have said, this civil fraud trial, more than all of the other cases that has consumed his interests, has brought him back to Lower Manhattan day after day for this trial because it has to deal with his money.
And I see Major Garrett over here shaking his head.
One of the things this will go to is the value of Donald Trump's word. And there is something in this document, page 36 again, that shed some light on that. When challenged in a deposition about some particular tax valuation for Mar-a-Lago, he is asked, do you intend to do that? And the former president in the deposition says, when you say intend doesn't mean we will do it. So a document that seems to suggest you have intention and are agreeing to that intention in perpetuity, as this particular tax document does, the former President Trump says on the record, that doesn't mean we're going to do it. It means whatever we say it means, which goes to the heart of this underlying case and may, in that context, have political resonance beyond this afternoon.
Everything is so politically upside down. We are 18 days before Super Tuesday, and when we get the expected comment from Donald Trump himself about this judgment, it would be such a contrast to what President Biden was speaking about today, the death of Alexei Navalny, this outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin, this pressing international issue of the day. Donald Trump's statements from his organization and his attorney are about a civil judgment, with no indication this changes the political calculus for him or for the race at all.
All right, and I want to give Ricky Kleeman a chance to chime in. I know she was speaking or also wanted to chime in really quickly after Robert Costa was speaking about the election, obviously, and what the implications are there.
Well, I think that it's not only Robert Costa, but it's also Scott and Major. We've talked about this, and it is clear that the political and the legal collide at all times here. One of the things that they also brought up that I think is really important, it's one thing to say, for the judge to say that, and the AG to say, that this affects the marketplace, and that's why there should be such an extraordinary punishment. And I note again that there has never been such an extraordinary punishment when there have been no victims who have complained and when the money was paid back. So this case is singular. And so that will fall right into the rubric of the campaign. And it's exactly the words that Alina Habba has said. There are people in the real estate industry in New York that were very concerned about a judgment of any kind of magnitude. And this is extraordinary magnitude. And it has been said by people in the real estate industry that if it can happen to Donald Trump, it could happen to anyone if you want to wipe out an industry. So we can't negate the fact that there are other feelings out there in the community and the business community. This is not a simple win or loss. This is really complicated.
All right. Ricky Kleeman, Katrina Kaufman, Robert Costa, Scott McFarland, Major Garrett, thank you guys all for breaking that down for us. Once again, the headline this hour, a blockbuster ruling in the New York civil fraud trial against former President Donald Trump. A judge found Trump and the Trump Organization is liable for falsifying business records by overvaluing his assets and exaggerating his net worth in order to get better terms on loans. Trump is now ordered to pay more than $350 million in penalties and is barred from holding office at a New York company and getting loans from New York banks for 3 years. His children are barred for 2 of those years. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Jerika Duncan in Washington.